Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. You're listening to Latin Waves. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson. I'm delighted to be joined by Yves Engler. Thank you for joining us, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
Now, many people have long, been overwhelmed by the COVID pandemic, by, mining issues in Canada, by, wars abroad. But few people hear in the news about Palestine. Can we talk a little bit about why this part of the world seems silent and yet its people have been under constant aggression for decades?
The simple answer is that Canada and the U.S. are complicit, have enabled Israeli Zionist dispossession of Palestinians for more than a century. And so there's just so many different ways in which we're complicit in the racism, the violence, the injustice, dispossession. Those different ways. You can have a talk for hours and hours. I go over all of them, but from the simple, just a couple of days ago, the Trudeau government withdrew from the International UN Racism Conference. It's connected to the Durban process because the previous conference, it was viewed as too much criticism of Israel. To the fact that there's, charities in this country that registered Canadian charities, subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer, that raise more than $250 million a year, sent to Israel-focused projects. Some of those projects support the Israeli military. Some of those projects support explicitly racist institutions in Israel. Some of those projects support West Bank settlements, which is supposed to be against Canadian charity law. Yet they still have registered. They still have their ability to provide tax breaks to Canadian donors. There's Canadians recruited for the IDF, a couple hundred Canadians that are in the Israeli military. You have law on the books in Canada, the Foreign Enlistment Act, that says it's illegal to recruit for a foreign military. Yet you have open, explicit recruiting taking place by both the Israeli consulate and United Jewish Appeal of Toronto, a major charitable organization, as well as less explicit recruitment taking place by other groups. So there's just Canada has a trade agreement with Israel that includes the West Bank, where on the legal Israeli settlements, that includes the Israeli custom laws are applied on products that are produced in illegal Israeli settlements, i.e., supposedly the Palestinian, state. So, there's just an endless examples of how Canada has coddled, has enabled Zionist Israeli dispossession of Palestinians. So when the subject comes up in the dominant media in this country, it's almost entirely sort of a skewed perspective. It downplays the history of colonialism. It acts like it's sort of two equal sides. Whenever an Israeli is killed, it gets 10 times more attention than a Palestinian, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, so Canada is, for a long, long time before the creation of Israel, has been heavily tied to the Zionist movement's dispossession of Palestinians.
It strikes me that whenever there is in Canada, a murder, someone dies, there's a lot of news reported, and yet, we've seen that in this last attack by Israelis, at least 50 Palestinians have been killed. And to me, the problem is not just the people are being killed and the impunity of it, right? The impunity with which the government not only cause us to be blind to it because our news media won't report it, people won't know. And so making people feel isolated, like they're alone, I think is part of the imperial tactic of, divide and conquer. And so for those who have been hiding under a rock and don't know the history of Palestine and how Israeli government has been implanted there and taken Palestinian lands, can you give us a brief history lesson where people can self-locate, and understand the level of displacement that has taken place against Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, basically, what Israel is a very it's a 20th century European colonial project. I'm kind of similar in some ways to the earlier European colonial projects that took place in Canada and the U.S., where Europeans came and displaced indigenous people, and they displaced them through all kinds of different means, but always with the violence as being either direct or hovering quite closely in the background. That's what Israel is, and it's only been successful because of its having the backing of the most important empire of the day, the British Empire, which Canadians were involved in 1917 in conquering Palestine. Hundreds of Canadians fought to conquer Palestine for the British. It was actually a Canadian general that led what was ultimately a first attempt that failed to capture Gaza, and a later attempt succeeded. And then after World War II, I mean, the Zionist movement initially didn't have majority support among the Jewish community within Europe. Presented as just a sort of defense of European anti-Semitism, and that's an important part of it. But it comes out of late 1800s nationalism and imperialism that's flowing through Europe at that period. So the reality is there's a long history, predating history of anti-Jewish policies in Europe. And the reason why Zionism becomes viewed as the response to those discriminatory policies is because there's nationalism sweeping across Europe. And it's a time when, Italy and Germany have just been united as countries, and where there's a scramble for Africa taking place from 1885 to a 20-year period. The African continent goes from about 10% European run to 90% European run. And so basically a form of Jewish nationalist imperialism, which is essentially what Zionism is, Jewish nationalist colonialism, maybe better put, develops, and it gets supported by the British Empire. And then alongside that, you have the horrors of World War II and huge numbers of Jewish immigrants from Europe that the North American countries don't want to take, and they again go into Palestine. So you have a large enough number of Europeans, of settlers, and then they get all kinds of backing from Canada, the U.S., and others diplomatically at the UN after World War II. And they create a state, and as part of creating that state, they ethnically cleanse somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 Palestinians over a multiple month period in 1947 and 1948. They create a state, and that state has been since that time born of violent ethnic cleansing. It has continued to be an incredibly belligerent force. Israel is a small country, fairly small population, but it's been involved in invading and bombing pretty much every country in the region, multiple occasions, from Egypt to Lebanon to Iraq to Tunisia to Syria. And the worst victims have always been the Palestinians, who were driven from their homes in 47, 48. Some small percentage were able to stay within what became known as Israel proper. And then in 1967, Israel conquered even more of historic Palestine, the remaining 22% of historic Palestine, and drove hundreds of thousands more Palestinians from their home. And since that time, they've been, occupying Palestinian lands. Gaza is a little bit more complicated because it's sort of not under a formal occupation, but it effectively is under. Israel has control over its airspace, over its coasts. It's basically kind of people locked in there, primarily because of Israel, secondarily because of Egypt. And so there's been this incredible, flagrant injustice for the Palestinians. And, that comes right up until today where, Israel's stealing more Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem, which is supposed to be part of the Palestinian state that Canada claims it supports. Other countries claim they support, stealing more Palestinian homes. Israel's dominating the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holy mosque in Islam, and violently displacing people who are praying in the mosque in recent days, and then it leads to an escalation with Hamas in Gaza, which most people in Gaza were driven from their homes. I think about 60% plus of the people who live in Gaza were people who were driven from their homes in 47, 48 within Israel, and put into this very small strip of land. And so, the injustices of Zionism and the Israeli government are just so stark. And now we have a situation where things have escalated into a conflict, a military conflict between some of the forces within Gaza and the Israeli military. And of course, Israel has already killed 65 Palestinians, including 15 children, in Gaza. And all indications look like it's going to get, it's going to further escalate. But what's important, I think, most of all for people who are in Canada to keep in mind is the extent to which Canada has contributed to the dispossession of Palestinians historically, and right up until today, where you just have so many different ways in which the Canadian government, from simple statements, right? If you just listen to what Justin Trudeau says about what's going on, it's completely divorced from reality. It acts like there's more Israelis that are killed. In fact, there's way more Palestinians killed. It acts like there's some equivalence between the oppressive colonial state and the impoverished colonized. It acts, just completely divorced from reality. And frankly, it's even there are statements that are even politicians in like other European countries are way more sort of reasonable. Canada's right at the extreme edge with the U.S. and maybe Australia, and a very, very small number of others in these just diplomatic backing that's kind of unique. And then if you just going through all kinds of other forums, from weapon sales to Israel to subsidies, that the research subsidies that Canada-Israel research accords, to other things I mentioned earlier, from illegal recruitment of Canadians to fight in IDF, to all these charities, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of charities. I estimated since 1967, when Canada brought in its current form of tax subsidies for donations to charitable organizations, about $5 billion in Canadian money has been channeled to Israel. And so that would put about a third of that would be subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer. So something like $1.5 billion of Canadian taxpayer money that's been funneled to Israel. Now, Israel has a GDP equivalent to Canada's, right? So it's GDP. So there's no other country in the world where there's we're supporting universities and the symphony and the Red Cross and all the different institutions within Israel. They have a Canadian Friends of group that fundraises for those institutions. But how much money are we funneling to Japan or Sweden? None. There's basically no charities that are raising money for projects in Sweden. How many groups in Israel are being subsidized by the Israeli government to support Canadian universities or Canadian symphony or the Canadian museums, and on and on and on? The Israel coddling or exemption of Canadian law even is quite a unique phenomenon, where there's just so many ways in which the Canadian government, Canadian political private life institutions, say, enable this colonial project.
Many people would argue that the UN, it's this body, right, that represents our so-called democratic processes. Can you speak to the level of complicity that this so-called international body has participated in? They did call, the UN Security Council did make a statement calling for a ceasefire, against Israel, declaring that this was obviously a crime and an act of war, and they call for a ceasefire. But yet, immediately, the U.S. blocked this measure. How is it possible that 5 countries can have so much power to silence what the majority of the world recognizes as a crime?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the Security Council, with regards to the recent days in Palestine, it was 14. It was 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council that backed the resolution. That it was the U.S. that blocked it from moving forward. One thing that's kind of interesting for Canadians, we were involved in a campaign against Canada's bid for a seat on the Security Council. That was ultimately Canada failed back in last year. And the 2 countries that won were Norway and Ireland. Norway was the country that actually sponsored the resolution, and Ireland, of course, backed it and actually was involved in potentially sponsoring an earlier version. So if Canada would have won its bid for a seat in the Security Council, there's basically no way it would have sponsored the resolution, and it's probably very likely that it would have actually voted against it. So for those of us who were involved in this campaign to defeat Canada's bid for a Security Council seat, this is a sort of proof that our efforts were well used. But yeah, I mean, the Security Council, there's a long history of the Security Council, everyone on the Security Council agreeing to different resolutions to basically apply international law on illegal Israeli settlements. And the one country that vetoes those resolutions is the U.S. And the Security Council is an undemocratic structure, and it is a structure that Canada supported way back during the creation of the UN, to the dismay of most of the smaller countries. But it's definitely a structure that needs to be reformed for the perspective of Palestinians and many other groups that have been colonized and dispossessed.
For many people, the example of imperial powers, dispossessing people. I mean, the people of South Africa were removed from their lands, and we call that apartheid. The people in Turtle Island, have been sent to reservations, and they call it apartheid. And the people in Palestine literally incarcerated within Gaza because they can't exit. They can't get access to what they need, and they're constantly being accosted by violence. We've seen the demolition of buildings. We've seen bombings. We've seen, the complete demolition of their sacred, orchards with olive trees, which to anyone would be an atrocity of war. So what silenced this crime from being denounced, from being seen as an act of apartheid?
Well, I mean, I think it's the different power structures. I mean, the dominant media obscures what's going on. When they cover it, they obscure what's going on. The different political parties that are, they go along with it. There's a very influential Israel lobby in Canada that's basically supports no matter what Israel, no matter what they do to Palestinians. So there's different political forces that are aligned against the honesty and truthful discussion, because proper discussion. I mean, Canadians already have shown support for sanction or measures that curtail Canadian support for Israel because of its mistreatment of Palestinians. And if there was an honest discussion in the dominant media of what's happened to Palestinians and Canada's role in that, it would be the population would be way more supportive of government changing government policy. But like most issues, it's an information battle. It's a organizational battle. The pro-Palestinian movement over the past couple decades has become way better organized than previously. There's now multiple organizations that are have paid employees that are able to do this work full time. So there's big I've written about the history of, if you go back to 1947-48, where Canada played this really important role diplomatically in justifying ethnic cleansing of Palestine, effectively providing the Zionist movement with a legitimating their ethnic cleansing with the partition plan. At that point, there was almost no criticism of Canadian policy. Well, today, I was at a demonstration on Monday. It was like 300-400 people in a last-minute, 24-hour organized demonstration against what's going on right now. There was another one yesterday here in Montreal. There's going to be another one on Saturday. I've been to a number of demonstrations over the years that have been thousands. I think some of the biggest ones here in Montreal have been up to like 10,000 plus. So there's a lot more awareness on the issue. It's still not enough to really tip the scales. But like I was talking about, if you look at the NDP convention recently, some of that activism that's been building up over years, decades, is starting to trickle into a major political party, and that's starting to have some effect on the broad political culture. The Israel lobby, the dominant media, the political parties that are supportive of the status quo, they're not they're certainly not all powerful. They have been able to shape policy and shape the discussion, but increasingly their ability to do so is weakening.
I love that you bring us to this, the immensity of the struggle, right? How hard and how dangerous it has been for Palestinian people, and yet also remind us of the power of people power. When people are organized, when people mobilize, we can literally, move things in a different direction. How do you keep engaged? How do you keep energized and motivated to see this? Because this is a struggle that has began long before you were alive, and hopefully will see an end to it in your lifetime. And yet, it's not about how soon or how fast we win, but what we lose when we don't engage. In justice, right? In the vision, in the dream of having a world where people are not oppressed and we're silenced, where we're not witness who just watch in silence.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. That there's you lose a little bit of yourself by turning away, right? By just trying to act like this massive injustice is not taking place. And I can tell you on a personal level, there can be consequences, right? There can be a lot of attacks, personal attacks for really challenging the dominant narrative on this issue. So I think that's important. But it's also when you look at the injustice, right? I just on an image making rounds online about a little, maybe 10, 12-year-old boy in Gaza who's I guess his father has just been killed, and he's kind of like realizing, or he's sort of seeing just as his dad's death, and just sort of seeing the look on this kid and how kind of horrible it all is. And then when you know a bit of the history of what brings us to this today of his father being killed, It's not just anyone being killed in almost any circumstance is a heart-wrenching thing. But when you see that this is actually just the outgrowth of a century-long dispossession process that continues right up until today, to the point where this 10-year-old is going to have to deal the rest of his life with his father being killed. It's pretty hard to turn away. I think a mix of knowing about the issue and sort of knowing the history, but also sort of seeing some of the real toll. It's not just some abstraction. In one sense, in my life, it is a bit of an abstraction. But when you see the young kid whose father's just been killed, and then on the other side is the fact that you see that there is a lot of activism going on in this issue. There has been, and I've seen it lived through 20 years of growing consciousness on the issue and growing organizational power of pro-Palestinian movement, and there's a lot of factors in wanting to engage and campaign on this issue.
Thank you so much for all your work, for all the ways that you keep our memories awake and willing to remember, and engage in the process of remembering, because violence is what's forcing us to forget. The violence of hunger, the violence of unemployment, the violence of being singled out, and but to me, the community is immunity. The only way we are strong is in communing with others, in community with those, and it matters what we do. It matters what we fail to do. And so for me, I think nobody gets to live forever, but it matters how we live. So I appreciate you for all the work and all the ways that you have dedicated your efforts to awakening our memory. So thank you. How can people access your book? How can people join
I think they're available at many of the different bookstores and libraries. My website is yvesengler.com, yvesengler.com. And if people are interested in Canadian foreign policy issues more broadly, people can check out foreignpolicy.ca, which is the website of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. So foreignpolicy.ca.
Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Take care.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com. Visit Latin Waves Media to hear previous shows, to access resources, or support our efforts towards social change via community project engagement. Thank you and bye for now.